Evening, everyone, and welcome to the third installment of Faithful Conversations. If you've been following this webinar series, then you know that tonight is our third installment in a six-part series to engage faith leaders in issues that are polarizing or dividing the faith community today. My name is Rebecca Wheeler-Walston, and I am the owner of Solid Foundation Story Coaching, and I'm honored to be collaborating with Sojourners in this webinar project. Tonight, we have three panelists with us, the first of which is Betsy Shirley, and she is the editor-in-chief of Sojourners Magazine. We also have Pastor Jarvis Williams, and he is the director for Race and Democracy at the Horizons Project. And then finally, Pastor Carlos Malavé, who is the founder and president of the Latino Christian National Network. And tonight, we're going to engage the question of how do we preach and teach truth in an age of lies and disinformation. We have a lot to cover. I'm not sure that we'll get to everything that we want to cover, but there will be a chat that will be open for you as our listeners to pose any questions or comments that you'd like the panel to consider. And as we get towards the end of our evening, we will ask the panel to directly engage any questions that are posted there. Also, I want you guys to know that a recording of this conversation will be posted on our Sojo Action YouTube page, along with resources and discussion questions if you'd like to use tonight's conversation in your own community. So I think that's all I have by way of announcements, and I would love for us to just get started. So my first question of the evening to our illustrious panel is, how do you understand the concept of truth in your own professional context? So let's start with Betsy, the editor-in-chief of Sojourners Magazine. How do you understand the concept of truth in this day and age as a journalist, Betsy?
Well, I feel like somebody needs to start off with like a Pontius Pilate joke, right? Like, what is truth? So I'll do the honors there. Um, no, I would say the answer is all of the above. Um, and I guess for me, when I think about truth, truth is about trust, and trust is about relationships. And I'll give you an example. When I first started at Sojourners, um, I was a fact checker. That was my full-time job, was to go through every article in the magazine, every issue, and try to basically dissect it. And as far as I could figure as a 22-year-old just out of college with the internet, figure out, what's true in this article. And I loved it because I'm a nerd. But what you end up doing is you look through the article and you say, okay, what can we verify here? So like names, is this the right name? Is that the name the person goes by? Is that the right title? How do they spell it? Even with something as basic as a name, which you would think, oh, that'd be pretty easy to fact check, you start to realize like, oh, well, this person uses one name on their social media platform and they use their initial in this middle thing. And then, oh gosh, they don't use that last name anymore. I wonder like if they changed their name. And so you start to realize pretty quickly as a fact checker that it's really about what source of information do you think is most credible. And once you get to which sources are most credible, you're making a judgment about what do you think is most trustworthy. So, and when I think about truth, I think about like, okay, as a journalist, if I'm trying to verify someone's name, well, that's easy. I'm going to go and we're going to ask them what they prefer. So that one's not so hard. But like if you get into a statistic that's really complicated, it takes some time to muddle through. And what my role as a fact checker was to try to say, okay, based on these sources that we think are really credible, and we had different ways we tried to determine what was credible. How much authority does someone have? How close are they to this thing that we're trying to figure out? What kind of expertise? All these different things. And I'd try to say, okay, yep, that checks out. I'd include a link. I'd send it back to the editor, who would then check me and make sure I wasn't going crazy. And then they'd talk with. So there's even just in that process of fact checking, which you would think is very oh, it's just the facts. It's relational. It's me saying like, okay, well, here's what I was able to find. This seems pretty accurate, but if you're not including this part, these years, you actually might want to include, and then, explaining, and then the author and the editor would work out, okay, what's the best way to communicate what's most accurate here? So, it's certainly about integrity, spiritual integrity too, but yeah, I'll let the other panelists jump in.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing to note, the word spiritual integrity or the phrase spiritual integrity. So, given that our two remaining panelists are both pastors in their own right, first, Pastor Jarvis, what's your sense of how you come to this notion of truth, particularly in this day and age where that seems to be almost a volatile concept?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. I love Betsy's framing, so I'm going to borrow the frame because she lifted up this idea of the source. What sources are you looking at, and how reliable are they? And so for a faith community, um, communities have a history of going to certain sources to find truth. And so the biblical text is a source that becomes an opportunity to discern where truth might be in the moment. But testimonials, the stories that communities of faith have told, are also sources of truth. What becomes interesting coming from the community of faith that I was reared in is that many of the sources of truth that comes out of that community wouldn't check the box for some of the verifiable factual data that would come out of the challenge for truth in Betsy's presentation, because some of their stories would not have been told. Some of their records would have been burned. Some of their voices would have been muted in the discourse. And so I think in this particular moment, coming from a community that has been kind of inundated with claims about them and claims about the world that was so vastly untrue. I think there is an added component to thinking about truth for those who have been the victims of lies for a long time. And that is, they have to be suspicious from certain sources because those sources have been more of an agent of their destruction than an instrument of truth. And I think one of the challenges we have as a nation is that exact problem. Can you trust the sources of information you once relied on to give you the information you need to have to make the choices you ought to have? How reliable are they? And I don't know if that's a new thing in this country or a new thing in the human drama, but I think it's a more pronounced question now. And so for me, truth, community, the sources of people who've been in the struggle, the source of the divine as it has come to us through certain religious texts. And then I think there is another claim on truth that it emerges in the community in strange ways. And so that's not privileged by the book. It's not privileged by particular voices, but sometimes I think the story of Jesus where he says, out of the mouth of babies, somehow another children and animals and the stars can give truths to us. The flower fades, the grass withers, and we say, oh, and then a truth emerges and we act on it. So I think for me, those are sources of truth that I have tried to be attentive to as I engage in communities of faith and in the world in general.
I really liked what you said about the sort of the contrast between Betsy's sense of like what's factually accurate and your sense of what might be coming from a sort of a grassroots community-oriented space. And you mentioned this idea that, if those stories are not told, if they've been muted, if they've been intentionally suppressed, we might not hear it. I'm curious, Betsy gave a really maybe helpful sort of example. I'm curious if you have an example of that kind of contrast that you're drawing.
Absolutely. I'll give it to you in the way our community talked about it. It was a song, and they would say, nobody knows the trouble that I've seen. Nobody knows but Jesus. And what they would be referring to is the terror that people would impose on them in rural areas in Mississippi, where young children would get taken away from homes and never seen again. What would happen in jails where people would be beaten and brutally harmed, and there was no opportunity for their voices, due process to be heard. Or the story of James Cone, the cross and the lynching tree, where there were lynchings that we still don't know about. But if you go to certain communities, whispers of what happened still prevail, but we don't have verifiable evidence that it happened. So those are some examples, and it could go on, of what I would argue are those truths that sometimes only a few in only a certain community have been able to hold on to the trouble they've seen.
Carlos, your sense of this very sort of somber moment in the conversation, how do you, from your community, come to this question of truth?
Thank you, Rebecca. And as I listen to Jarvis and Betsy, I'm going to start in a strange place, which will seem a strange place. Obviously, I speak as a pastor and maybe as a public theologian also. And I'll use one text, which it may seem when I read it exclusivist, but give me a minute and I'll explain to you. And that's John 14:6. Jesus said, I am the truth. I am the truth. And so I cannot begin to talk about truth if I don't go to what I believe is the source. And so I'll say that the truth is found in Christ. That doesn't mean, and I'm not saying that the truth is found in Christianity. I'm saying that the truth is found in Christ. And I believe that Christ is in all of us. By that I mean Christ is in every human being. And I believe he's the source of truth. At the same time, we know that we as human beings, we also harbor lies or untruth, or we can be easily deceived. So in that regard, then I think that the discovery of truth must be a communal work or a communal exercise. In many ways, I will describe it as Christ talking to Christ's self through all of us. So it's a communal discovery of the source of the truth that is in Christ, the Christ that is in all of us. And so the truth not only must be something that we agree upon through this collective and communal process of discovery, but I will also say that must be good and it must be beneficial to all. And if it's not good and if it's not beneficial to us, to me, that is not true. It's not truth. A version of truth that is beneficial to only one group of people, but it's not beneficial to another group of people, cannot be true. That cannot be truth. And just let me share very quickly a few just thought that maybe expound a little bit on this, and on this I'll be borrowing from one of my heroes, my theological heroes, which is mystical, the mystic John Merton, and so Merton taught that truth is not just about facts or arguments. He said that truth comes from living an authentic life and seeking God. It comes from moving beyond our ego and our self-centeredness and putting the good of all at the center of that process of seeking the truth. So we can know the truth fully only if we are willing to put aside pride, to put aside power, to put aside debate, and we must be humble and open and loving That's the way we can discover what is truth, a truth that is a truth for all of us, which is very elusive, but it must be a communal work of discovering the heart and the source, which I believe is Christ.
That's a lot. I have lots of thoughts going through my mind, lots of questions. I'm curious, if you could, you speak of the process, right, of coming to a sense of something that's true. Do you have something of a tangible example that you could maybe give our listeners where you've kind of gone through that process?
Um, I mean, I have gone through that process. I cannot necessarily tell that that process is always successful, but yes, I have been through that process. In my experience, I began my Christian journey in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And so in that particular tradition, they have a very, very strict understanding of what is truth and very exclusivist way of understanding the truth. And throughout the year, I left that church many years ago. And but I still have relatives who are members of that church. And friends who are still members of that church. And so I have had the opportunity many times to engage in dialogue with them. I actually was talking just last week to one denominational leader in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we had a very, very cordial and Christian-like conversation. And so it does work. It does work. I mean, I can tell many other examples, but let me just say that. I thought about one thing that it's important. It's also, and again, I go back to the Gospel of John, chapter 16, where we read that the Holy Spirit will guide you into all the truth. Holy Spirit will guide you into the truth. And again, obviously, what that means is that there is truth. There is a source, a credible, real, true source of truth. And we must recognize in humility our limitations and the fact that if we don't agree on accepting our limitations and knowing that only through this process of guidance, through the Holy Spirit of God, we can get to truth, we will not get there. So there's a sense of humility that we need to have as we work towards truth.
What I really have appreciated about all the answers from the panel is a sense of like the texture of what truth can be, right? We started with a conversation around it being about facts and how can we actually check those facts to come to some sense of accuracy for the information that we hold. And then this sort of invitation into what's actually happening on the ground in the lives of real people, and where are the stories of what is true for a community actually not coming to the surface because they're being suppressed, or they have been buried, or their voices have been silenced. And then to move into this sense of what does it mean to come to that as a person of faith and step into the idea that truth comes from God. And that can we, in the process of engaging the Holy Spirit, really think about with a sense of humility, what might be true. One last question I have for you guys on truth, and then we'll move to something about disinformation. But Carlos mentioned this idea that if something is not true and good for the whole, it can't stand as truth. And so I'm curious, given the diversity that's on this panel, in some ways that are obvious, in other ways that may not be obvious, how do you guys come to the idea of wrestling with what might be true for one does not feel or seem on its face like it could be true for the person sitting next to you? So any takers?
I will begin, and I think what I'm going to share with you applies to your question, and I'm going to quote is a very fresh quote from Pope Leo XIV. So just today, the new Pope said that we have to look together how to be a missionary church. That's not the part that I guess I want to emphasize, but then he says by building bridges, dialogue, always open to receiving with open arms for everyone. And that's the human process that I was talking about. So I mean, it's about building bridges, and I mean, I have dedicated probably the last 25 years of my life and ministry to build bridges. And that means that I and we must recognize that we don't have, all of us, the full truth. We just have partial truth. And so that process of crossing bridges and finding ourselves in the center and engaging with each other in dialogue and open arms is essential to discover truth. If we are not willing to do that, we will never reach truth.
Betsy, Jarvis, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a poignant experience these days, or I think we've all had these experiences, right? Where we're talking to that one uncle or that family friend or that person you went to school with, and suddenly they are living in a world that is so different than what you understand to be true. And I think that's why I started with saying that when you want to talk about truth, you talk about trust, and that's relational. And so, you know, it's really hard to do. And I will not say that I do this all the time, but especially as someone who's trained as a fact checker, because I kind of want to jump in there with like, hey, actually, did you know? Which when you're in the kind of moment I think you're describing, Rebecca, it's not that helpful. Which the journalist in me kind of hates, but it's an invitation when you're in that moment. Okay, if there is this relational or kind of what Carlos was saying, that communal work of truth, if what you're understanding and what I'm understanding is different, tell me more. How'd you come to that conclusion? What makes you think that? Gosh, how does that square with, this other thing that I know you really care about because we're in a relationship here. That's hard. That is so hard. That is an easy sentence to say and a really hard thing to do. I don't think you can fact check your that relationship in the way that you're describing. Really important skill when you're making a magazine. Different when you're in a relationship with someone that you're trying to communicate with who has a different understanding of reality.
Love that. Any last thoughts, Jarvis?
Yeah, that's a loaded topic. I think what I would add is the idea that there is a universal truth that we can put our hands on is seductive. And I think if you look at some of the examples of where human communities have attempted to elevate a particular kind of claim and make it the claim governing other claims, in the wake of those practices, you find a lot of interesting behaviors that I think goes to Carlos's point, and that is you'll find in the name of progress, you'll muddle conversations around destruction. In the name of progress, you'll muddle conversations around theft. And we have a tendency, if you study how humans have behaved, when we reach for those grand gestures of truth and universal claims of progress and universal claims of freedom and universal claims, in the wake of those claims, whether you're looking at the Enlightenment, whether you're looking at when the Roman emperor took over the Christian faith and then it becomes a weapon for empire, there's very interesting behavioral patterns that we share. And so I'm suspicious of a reaching for of high universal claims. But I do think it is a part of the human drama that we keep trying to reach for claims that can be accountable to everyone. And I think it's our drive to want to be accountable to all, to reach for the universal, and then the baggage and the consequences of our failures that really accurately describes why, when we have conversations with people, they humble us with what we thought was true over and over again. And I hope that will always be the case, because I would never want us to get so clear about what we know to be true that we stop listening.
Rebecca, would you allow me a minute or two?
Absolutely.
I know we need to move forward, but I wanted to say this. Obviously, I know that we probably will agree that today is very difficult to discern truth and to even discern truth how I'm proposing, which is a communal exercise. That's not easy to do. And one of the reasons why I think it's not easy to do is because we don't only see truth from our own clan perspective, which we do, but it became really bad because many of us today are unable to see or accept reality of what is happening. So it's more basic, not even truth. It's about reality, and we can talk for hours about this. But we are unable to see reality or even understand reality together. And we look at what it's maybe happening in our country, and we are unable to see eye to eye what is happening. So it's very profound. I'll give you a very quick example. And this is very recent for me. The week before Easter Sunday, I had an experience that moved me to decide to take a break from social media. I never do Lent fasting or anything, and so it just happened that it was the Holy Week before it started. And so what happened was that I posted some things, and then I have a couple of people who are dear to me. And the way they responded to this post, it left me silent. And it was this point. It was, how can they not understand the reality we are living? It affected me so much that I said, I'm going to take a break from social media. And it's been a month now. It's been a month since I don't go to social media. I sneak a little bit to post something, but I don't look at social media. I don't read it and it's been doing good to me, I can say.
So we've sort of spent the last several minutes talking about how we come to the question of what is true, right? And I meant for that to be a bit of a backdrop to this next question of how have you encountered misinformation, lies, inaccuracies, like in this current moment? Like, how is that landing in your world, professionally, personally, right? And what's the impact? What has the impact been for you in that space of misinformation? And I will give you just a brief example that Betsy and I talked about a little bit. I have a teenage son. So because he's a teenager, most of his world is influenced by social media. He doesn't watch TV, he doesn't listen to the news, he doesn't listen to the radio. He gets his sense of the world from social media. And he came through the door recently after school and asked me, hey, Mom, did you hear what is happening with the National Museum of African American History and Culture? My first reaction was like, yeah, I heard, and I'm really angry about it because I have a particular story in my mind that I saw on my social media account about what is happening with the exhibits in that museum. And my son that's my power to the people kid. Like, he loves history. He cares very deeply about Black history. And so for him to ask that question is to say, like, the answer to this question is going to impact the way I see the world, right? And so I said to him, let's look it up. So I took the 5 seconds it takes to put something in Google, and what appeared on my page is conflicting stories about what's actually happening in that museum, right? And so my answer to my son is, actually, there's two conflicting stories in the media right now. One says that exhibits are being removed, and the other says they aren't, right? And that put a pause for him on, what's the opinion I'm going to form around this? And how's it going to impact how I engage my world for the next 30 minutes, 30 days, right? 30 months. And so that's what comes to my mind when I think about where and how has misinformation sort of impacted my teenage son and his world, right? And I have to say, there's this moment of relief. I'm like, I'm glad I said, let's look it up. I'm glad I just didn't pop off and say, yeah, this is happening, because I would have, whatever I said could have been viewed as inaccurate, depending on which news source, as Betsy said, that we utilize. So that's my story, right? My question to the panel then is, how has misinformation landed in your world, in your communities, in your personal, professional life, and what's been the impact?
Well, I guess I can jump in first. I love the story and tell your son how.
Right.
I would say this. Wearing an organizer's hat, when you go into a community, what we are learning is that there are certain signals and messagings, strategies, tactics to get certain messages to certain demographics. So I live in Georgia currently, and when I turn on the TV and watch commercials and look at YouTube and watch a filter, there's a certain kind of informational trafficking that I'm a part of. If I go to Atlanta, the information flow looks different. If I'm in DC, the information flow looks different. So one of the challenges that we need to think about if you're in a community organizing space is what kind of truths and what kind of information has been given to a group of people and for how long. Because if you're part of a community that has heard for 10 years that the government is messing up life for them, then when you show up talking about we need to protect the government and we need to make sure the government is able to function, they've heard stories for so long that that's going to be a different conversation to have with them. And I think one of the challenges that mass communication is bringing to us, and it's not new to the human family. I think when the printing press came, there was an overwhelmed sense of dissatisfaction and frustration with who has information, who's an authority. Should it be the church? Should it be the reader? Is it the Bible? All the things. So we've seen what mass communication does to human community. It creates drama. In our current moment, I think a good community organizer doesn't start by telling the community what its truth is. It starts by trying to hear what truths the community already traffics in, and then figure out what's the best way to be a part of the community in an authentic way while bringing new truths for that community to consider. It's a slower process, but it gives the community a chance to be authentic. So for me, as an example, if you said, okay, we are in an authoritarian moment, and this is true. So this comes out of my work. And you say, okay. And you say, well, what does this look like? You say, well, freedoms are being suppressed. The ability to participate in decision-making is being stifled. The legitimacy of the rule of law and its exercise, whether in public decision-making in legislators or in the rule of law in courts, is being challenged. And rights are being infringed upon. Well, if you're from the South and that comes to you, you would say, okay, but the communities in the South have said those same exact talking points have been happening since the 70s and 80s. So an authoritarian introduction to one community is an authoritarian status quo in another. So when they have to talk to each other, which I become a bridge in this conversation, you have to ask the question, where is disinformation functioning? Because if you show up in a community who has lived what you're calling authoritarianism and they've been fighting it, and then you don't validate that fight, what kind of information are you trafficking in? Because if you won't validate that information, if you don't validate that experience, they would say you have disinformation. You have the wrong information about what our experiences have been. And you're acting as if our experience have been something it has not been. And why are you doing that? Right? And that's a real challenge. And I'm just using that term because that can go in many different ways, from whether you're talking about national issues to state, local issues. And I'm not trying to make the argument that there is not a serious authoritarian problem, but I am suggesting that if you are really doing the hard work of organizing people, you don't get to go into a space and dictate the truth that they're living by. You have to learn and negotiate with them about what their experiences are in order to see, okay, we've been telling you the rule of law doesn't work. 1990s, we had evidence that the courts were sentencing people diversely just by the color of their skin, and we didn't have a rule of law conversation about it. Not to the dramatic form. So we've allowed the rule of law to be compromised since the 1990s. Why now in 2025 are we saying, oh my God, it's really in threat now because we don't think the rule of law is really working? Well, we had evidence it wasn't working in 1990. And so that's the challenge of, for me, disinformation, because people have been living ideas that are patently false in real context. And trying to get them to reconcile that is a task.
Betsy, Carlos, your thoughts about how disinformation has impacted your world.
Well, I'll share a handy first before going into, there's so much wisdom here, but this is just a really simple trick that I learned. Sometimes we talk about misinformation and disinformation. Typically, I've heard misinformation is a mistake. Somebody shares it. Oops, they didn't realize the African American History Museum wasn't actually, taking things out. Oh, that was a mistake. Disinformation, deliberate. So disinformation, this. I don't know if that's helpful to y'all. That's always helpful to me. That's how I remember it. So people who are deliberately trying to seed things. And so when I think about deliberate lies, well, of course, that's a little loaded because who's to say what's deliberate? Obviously, as a journalist, one of the biggest ways that's been I've been impacted by disinformation is the mistrust in the media that has been, I think, very intentionally sown. Now, that didn't start when a certain presidential candidate started calling people fake news. That goes all the way back to the 70s, and you've been seeing a decline in media since then. What does start to happen around 2016 is you start to see a difference based on political party, and possibly other differences too, where, everybody had been kind of gradually losing some trust in the media. What happens is it starts to really decline for people who identify as Republicans versus those who identify as independents. It declines a little less, and those who identify as Democrats. This isn't to make it about partisanship, but what that means, and it ties exactly into what we were just saying, is that we've really lost an ability to have a shared story about what's happening because certain sources, trust, are really not trusted in some communities. Now, again, media already had a problem, and I think we didn't pay attention to that. And are now doing a lot of the work to try to rebuild in an authentic way some of that trust that was lost. But what's especially tricky for me is we're not the story we tell. What happened in the election of 2020? that's going to sound really different. And it's bringing up some of these moments, just like you shared. And I think as some of the folks listening in are sharing in the comments, where people live in these totally different realities. And I think the negative thing as a journalist, that makes the work really hard. It's hard to not be trusted. The silver lining, I guess, of that is that it makes us think really intentionally about what do we need to do to be trusted? What can we do to listen? There's a lot of news organizations for news that are saying, hey, if you want to regain trust with audiences, first thing you need to do, go listen to the people who don't trust you. Ask what they think you're getting wrong. Hey, how have we, the media, your newspaper, your magazine, portrayed you? What do you think is wrong about that? How does that make you feel? And start to do some of that work, even just, you're probably going to get some interesting information from them, but even just the act of asking that question is one of the things they recommend to journalists for, like, hey, if you want to start to rebuild trust. So it certainly fractured our media. I think it's turbocharged that in a way that's more partisan than I think it would have been otherwise. And I hope it pushes us to really think more intentionally as a media, whether we're, Sojourners, a Christian publication, or a bigger publication or a smaller publication, to think, hey, if we as journalists want to serve the public, we need to do some of that trust rebuilding work.
Thank you. Carlos, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. I'll give you two examples. One of them is an obvious example for me, being a Latino, and that is the way in which my community has been vilified in this time. We have been very clear as church leaders and leaders in our communities that we have been saying for more than 30 years there are things we must fix in our immigration laws. And we have been asking consistently all of the administrations during those 30 years, work on this, work together on this, fix this maybe mess that we have, all these loopholes, everything that need to be fixed. But our politicians didn't have the will to do that for so long from both parties. But then we come to a time where when we're living now, that it goes far, far beyond recognizing the things that we must fix or change. And now it comes to vilifying a whole community and using the vilification of that community as a political tool, and denying our country and especially our Latino community the facts that are true, the ways in which my community have blessed this country culturally, economically, and spiritually. And so that it seems to have disappeared, and we all of a sudden have become this pariah group of people that we must get rid of. And so that's very painful because the truth is being denied on that for political expediency. The other story, it's a very recent example for me. I wish I could go just back here to my back here where I am and show you the letter that I'm gonna make reference to. So this is the letter. This lady, a member of my church, came last week, just 6 days ago, and she said to me, Pastor, I would like for you to give me your opinion about this letter. And so the letter, it's a letter in which a group of supposedly an organization that it's an organization that work between Jews and Christians. In that letter, they are portraying settlers in Israel as victims. And it describes in beautiful ways how much they suffer, how much these settlers are persecuted. When I read that, I could not believe what I was reading. And so this old lady, she wants me to share with her and tell her what do I think about this, because she would like to propose to the women's ministry in the church to give money to these people who are suffering every day, these settlers. So I haven't talked to her. I need to talk to her, and I need to talk to her in the next few days. I don't know if I'll be successful in explaining to her who are the real people who are suffering, who are being persecuted, who are being killed, who are being annihilated. I don't know if she will be able to handle that truth. But it is really incredible how this organization, in this particular case, used this letter and sent this letter to people. I mean, basically lying to people about the truth, about the facts, about what is true. So,
Hmm. One of the things that I appreciate about this last several minutes is the sort of scope of the ways disinformation, misinformation, and I really appreciate that distinction, Betsy. How that has landed in different ways. Some maybe a little more lighthearted, like perhaps the conversation I had with my son, and others very somber and grave with very far-reaching and historical consequences, like what Carlos just offered, and how important that it is that we come to those moments, right? What's coming back for me is Carlos's earlier admonition. Can we do some collective communal work in this space to begin to understand what's true? And can we do that with a sense of if the truth does not benefit all, right? If in some way it brings harm to one, then it cannot stand a simple truth. That's an admonition I'll take with me.
yeah, Rebecca, if I may just add something very quickly. And I mean, thinking of this example that I gave you about Israel and Palestine and things like that, I'll say something very simple. I believe that truth is found in the eyes of the children who are fatherless and motherless in Palestine, in the eyes of the mothers who have lost children, and even truth is found in the eyes of the mothers of those who lost people in the attacks on October 7. Looking at the eyes of them, that is the truth, deep inside the eyes of those people, both groups.
Mm. I'm just gonna take a breath, right? Because this conversation has taken some sober turns, and rightly so, for this particular moment in history. We have a few minutes left. I promised our listeners that we would get to some questions. There's lots of comments in the chat, which I deeply appreciate. And so I'm going to do a little bit of summarizing there. There's a fair amount of thank you for the candor of this conversation to all the panelists. One question that was repeated a couple of times is, what is the difference between that which is inaccurate and that which is untrue?
I know Betsy probably is more qualified to have this conversation for sure. I think there's a question of how do we account for human error? So you want to tell a story, you just mishandled some facts, and so the accumulation of mishandled facts leads to a story that's told that's just, no one was malicious, it was just human error. That's a consequence of the story being wrong. And then you have an intentional injection of information for an outcome you want when you know that information is not true. Right. So if you say, you know, the welfare mothers are just stealing money overwhelmingly, right? And you don't have any really proof to it. But you know you want to cut a service. So you need to inject a story about it. Or You need to tell a story about illegals who are coming in to harm people. And you need to tell a story about a population who looks a certain way. Not because it's true, but you know that story can get you outcomes in legislation and get you outcomes in social programs. It get you outcome with the allocation of resources. So you inject the story because you know the story impacts the human situation in the way you want it. It manipulates people's real fears and real concerns and real questions. I think that problem is a different problem than just the accumulation of human error. So when I hear people really struggling with communication failures, I'm paying attention to the way we intentionally tell a story because there's an outcome associated with that story that serves what we want. And we prey on people's human fears and human fragility to get outcomes we want. And I think that practice is something that needs to be paid much more attention to. And I think when you listen to stories like Carlos, and when you listen to read Sojourners Magazine, when you listen to the African-American stories, you listen to Asian American stories, when you listen to these different stories, you can start to hear better. Or even the stories around what's happening with Appalachia, or the stories that happen around certain populations, or white men who are struggling with certain outcomes. I think sometimes we forget the people that are being targeted by a particular story. And I think the best of what we're after is to try to address that problem and always be aware that human error is not something we can ever completely wipe out. We just try to be accountable to those kinds of problems, but we need to confront and fight. And I don't mean, let me say not fight. We need to confront with a sense of urgency stories that are targeted toward outcomes that are harmful to the larger human family.
I will say that I'll put it another way. There are folks who, like, I'm thinking now, a relative of mine, who is a very simple person. This person is not even a deeply spiritual person, and he hears, and this is, I'm talking about a real person and what happened to this person. He hears things and in the media, in social media or in the news, and he became convinced of certain things he heard, and those things, from my perspective, are erroneous. They're not true facts. That's one person. I'm describing you one person. By the other hand, I know other people whom I love all of them, by the way. I can tell you another other person or other people, and this I'm thinking about actual people who, differently from this relative of mine, who there's a level of ignorance, I could say, in terms of knowing the actual facts. But this other person is a person who has a worldview and it's fully immersed in that worldview. And the reality for that person, it's only that worldview, and that person has spent time and probably years in a silo in convincing him or herself about that worldview, and it's unable to articulate things that we will consider simple truth, because that person cannot come out of that silo where that person is. So I see a difference between those two folks, those two kind of people, and I can name by name folks who go into the two categories. So one is some level, and I say this with respect, some level of ignorance to facts, but it's not necessarily a person who it's, let's say, that you cannot change his mind or talk to this person and make him or her see a different point of view. But then there are others who it's impossible to get through and to make them see this, that they're not necessarily telling truth, but they're living in a different world. And we have so many of those today.
I think, Carlos, that's a bit of an answer to a question that was in the chat about, this came from Andrea Johnson, about living, being a pastor in a rural church, and how is it that her kind and lovely and faithful people can deny what's happening in our nation? I think your answer was a bit of that. There's one other question that I wanted to just pose to the audience, to the panel as we close tonight. And this is the question, right? In the context of deep divisions that we face today, I'm deeply drawn to how faith can shape our moral imagination and serve as a tool for building a more equitable future. How can faith communities expand the public's moral imagination, not just to resist injustice, but to dream and build futures rooted in equity and a shared humanity? So do you need me to say the question again? How can faith communities help expand the public's moral imagination, not just to resist injustice, but to dream and build a future rooted in equity and shared humanity?
I'll start. And I don't know. I think I may answer the question. Call me on it if I don't. I pastor a congregation, two congregations that are in a very conservative area, and these folks are, even though they belong to a mainline denomination, for the most part, they're very conservative politically, and to a large extent socially conservative also. And so I come to teach and to preach, being here in this church for about a year and a half, almost two. And about 6 months into it, one of the denominational leaders asked me, Carlos, how are you doing? So I explained to him how I was doing, and then so he was surprised that I'm not having trouble yet with this congregation, because he knows what I believe, what I preach, what are my passions, basically about justice. And so he was surprised. And my response to that person is that these congregations, they feel that I love them and that I respect them. And so I honestly do. And it's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to do. There's one person in particular in one of my congregations that every time that I go to visit that person has to bring a certain political person into the conversation, and he praised that person, and I have to sit down and swallow, and I swallow it, and I don't pursue that conversation, and I don't attack him. I show him love, and I love him, and I keep going back. And they have learned, and this is not sanctimonious testimony, but this family have learned that I strongly disagree with their positions, but I strongly and honestly love them. And so that is not easy to do. And I don't claim that I do it perfectly. I don't, but I strive every day to do that, to keep loving them and to show them respect. And I think that as a pastor, more than all the justice sermons that I can preach, and I do, like almost every Sunday, the way that I respect and love them make the whole difference in the world.
Any last thought on that, Jarvis or Betsy?
Say, I think faith communities can experiment. You can try stuff. An article that every time we reshare it, it always gets a lot of interest is it's a story about how, hey, my church came together to try to pay off each other's credit card debt. It was this idea, this experiment. They just tried it. They, I think had some framing. So they started doing that, and that people are interested, like, what? How'd they do that? How'd it work? Just the act of, if you want to help expand the public's imagination, try something, experiment with it. That then starts to be like, oh, maybe we could do that. Or like, wow, why are all these people in debt? You know, that's the bigger imagination, right? And then like, whoa, what, maybe we need to change the system. So, of course, it's hard to do things in churches. I'm a member of a church, and it's like, you know, some days we're just trying to keep that old boiler from like, you know, doing its last round of heating. But to the extent you can be kind of experimental spaces, and talk about it, share that not just within yourselves, not in a like, hey, we did this really cool thing, braggy way, but be like, hey, here's what we're doing. I think that those acts of courage, imagination are contagious. Also, journalists love writing about them, just saying.
I,
You'll have the final word of the evening. What say you?
oh, you know better than giving the preacher the last word. We like to get excited. So I will say this. First of all, I think a good conversation with faith leaders should lead people asking the question that we're finished on. One writer says, God doesn't save us by flattering us. God saves us by confronting us. And so now that we've been confronted with certain things, the question becomes, what then do we do? And so here's a couple of things that can be done, that's being done. Church leaders, faith leaders could have state tables. And they could, on those state tables, to ask the question, does everybody have water, clean water? Does everybody have sanitation? Does everyone have food, access to food? Does everyone have access to the internet? And then they could use, those not partisan, you could use the faith, because the scriptural reference would be Jesus says, I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was in trouble, you visited me. And so those are basic truths that come out of a faith tradition that faith leaders could agree on. And if every state that has faith leaders had a table who use their energy to ensure clean water, sanitation, environment where their children are not plagued by environmental injustices, imagine what happens. Imagine what happens if we put our energy to advancing the goals that we believe God, worthy of our claims and worthy of our energy and worthy of our investment, would be proud that we are pursuing those things. And I think when we do that, that's where I hope good news really shows up. Because the idea of people who have a faith claim is that the world is better off because we're here. And what we do is not a transaction, but it's an expression of a larger truth about a larger God that is invested in all of us, to my friend Carlos's point. And I think when we do that, we're at our best. The challenge becomes, can we overcome the foolishness in us to actually do the work in the world? And it's not a personal, interpersonal, I just want to be the best person I can be to every individual I met. But what happens when a collective group of people collectively pursue a common good? And I'm ready to see and want to participate, and are seeing signs that there are people of faith doing that. And that's the part of that I think is good news in this dark moment.
So we need to wrap up. I want to express my gratitude to each of our panelists tonight for your candor, for your sober-minded and thoughtfulness, and for the little bit of humor and the chuckles that have accompanied this conversation this evening. And to say that be on the lookout for a follow-up email from the Sojourners team that will give you access to the video of this conversation. And we'll ask each of our panelists to recommend a resource that they have found helpful in the way that they come to this work and these questions. And we'll also provide a handful of discussion questions for that kitchen table conversation, or that conversation you have at church before the boiler gives its last sort of hurrah. And to say also that be on the lookout for our 4th installment of our webinar series, and that is going to take place in honor of Juneteenth. And so on the 12th of June, we will be joined by 3 panelists, and they will be addressing the question, why hasn't the American church made more progress in addressing racism? And joining us for that conversation will be author Jamar Tisby, the president and CEO of the Impact Movement, a college ministry, Jimmy McGee, and then finally, Dr. Derek McNeil, who is a professor and the president of the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology. So we will look to see everyone on the June 12th. And again, a very heartfelt thank you to Jarvis, to Carlos, and to Betsy for your candor and your contribution to this evening's conversation.